We're all familiar with Ratchet & Clank 4, which is Ratchet Deadlocked or Ratchet Gladiator in PAL regions. It was quite the departure from the 3 previous games, as Ratchet & Clank were sent to a gladiator combat arena known as Dread Zone, forced to participate in combat sports, essentially ending up as gladiator prisoners. This game had a much tighter focus on the shooting aspect, ultimately ditching both planet exploration and platforming. While the reception for this 4th Ratchet & Clank game was pretty mixed when the game first released, I think a lot of people have warmed up to it over the years. I would actually deem this as being one of the better Ratchet & Clank games, even though it deviates from the traditional formula. But what if I were to tell you that this wasn't the original vision for the 4th game? Revealed all the way back in 2012 via an Insomniac Games blog post talking about 10 years of Ratchet & Clank, as that year they were celebrating the 10th anniversary of the franchise, Insomniac Games revealed that the 4th Ratchet & Clank game was actually known as Nexus, which is funny considering that Insomniac would repurpose this name for the 2013 Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus, or as it's known as in PAL regions, just simply Nexus. Though the original concept of Nexus is actually very different compared to the 2013 version. There is no real connections or similarities or actual repurposing of that original concept that was put into the 2013 installment, because Insomniac did provide a small explanation on what the 4th game was going to entail, an entire Ratchet & Clank game concept that never materialized, Ratchet & Clank Nexus. Following Up Your Arsenal, we entertained the idea of putting our heroes on a singular planet. The design revolved around a global conflict between 2 alien races, and we thought it could be interesting if Ratchet & Clank had differing ideas about the war. Eventually, the project changed direction to become Ratchet Deadlocked, although the idea of one planet stayed with us and re-emerged in All For One. The only piece of content that we have publicly for this game is a concept art that was attached to this blog post, showing us this really dark and gloomy setting with a landscape that looks like it's been ravaged by this large mechanical beast. Underneath the large robot, we can see 3 foot soldiers that almost do depict the Thugs for Less enemies from Ratchet & Clank 2 and Into the Nexus. In fact, looking at this large robot, it does actually have some similarities to Mr. Eye, the large nether beast antagonist from Into the Nexus. At the top of the concept art it says, "One global conflict, 2 intergalactic heroes, Ratchet & Clank Nexus." From this one concept art alone though, it certainly does depict a more serious, darker toned Ratchet & Clank game compared to the first 3. But the one planet approach is definitely really interesting. Ratchet & Clank obviously revolves around going from one planet to another, including many different diverse environments. And like Insomniac mentioned, this idea was repurposed for All For One, taking place primarily on planet Magnus. Though technically, Insomniac had done this before All For One. Quest for Booty in 2008 took place on one planet, Murdergraw. Though you can't exactly count Quest for Booty to be a full-fledged Ratchet & Clank game, as it was a bite-sized experience. All For One's one planet approach though was actually kind of cool. It's one of the aspects of that game that I enjoyed the most. Rather than going to numerous planets with smaller level designs, you're now walking down this one straight path that has this world that feels connected. But I don't think that the idea of a one-planet Ratchet & Clank game was totally executed within All For One like the original vision of Nexus perhaps would have offered, due to the type of game that All For One is, a more multiplayer co-op focused title. When I was playing Rift Apart for the first time and visited Savali, which is a more open-ended, wide open level design, I remembered thinking to myself, this is actually kind of cool. What if the next Ratchet & Clank game were to take place in one singular location, one planet that has you exploring multiple different environments within the one world space. Not necessarily open world, I don't think Ratchet & Clank needs to go in quite that direction, but larger, more wide open area spaces similar to Rift Apart's Savali, with linear levels that connect these larger wide open areas. And I think that this was the direction that Insomniac Games were wanting to go in for the 4th game, as when we look at Up Your Arsenal, Insomniac were playing around with the idea of now incorporating vehicles into larger areas, along with Ratchet 2's Raritanium planets, Grelbin and Tabora, being more wide open spaces compared to what we had previously seen. I think at some point it was inevitable that Insomniac would eventually cross the concept of what if the entire game just takes place on one singular planet? And with the next Ratchet & Clank game seemingly coming to that conclusion of Ratchet finally discovering where the Lost Lombax race has ended up and that home world? What if the entirety of that game were to take place on one planet with bigger, more wide open areas, and the perspectives being switched between both Ratchet and Rivet as the game progresses, taking place in differing locations? Jumping back to Nexus though, it would have been interesting to see how this narrative would have played out. It very much describes this concept of both Ratchet and Clank being put in this moral dilemma, arriving on this planet to find themselves in the middle of a full-scale war. As war goes, there's reasons on both sides for why both sides are fighting. Oftentimes, it's actually kind of hard to label either side as being the good or bad team, and this is likely the position that Ratchet and Clank would have found themselves in during a scenario like this. This planet is being completely annihilated and absolutely ravaged, but which side should we assist? And I especially love this idea of both Ratchet and Clank having their own individual perspectives on this current conflict that is unfolding, where Clank may have understood the perspective of one side, whereas Ratchet would have understood the perspective of the other. And I'm absolutely sure that this would have, once again, similar to the very first game, brought both Ratchet and Clank back to butting heads, creating the sense of tension between the two. Again, this kind of dynamic hasn't actually been seen within the writing of Ratchet and Clank since the very first game. From the second game onwards, these guys have just remained best buds with absolutely zero disagreements. That's really though all we know about Ratchet & Clank 4 Nexus. While this original concept does sound incredibly cool, and yeah, I really want to see a game similar to this at some point in the series' future, clearly the idea of Deadlocked ended up beating out this original concept. This could have been because Deadlocked was just the better idea, or maybe it was a time frame issue. Perhaps what Insomniac were wanting to achieve with Nexus was just a little too ambitious for the amount of time they had to work on this fourth game. Remember that Insomniac were only given 9 months to put Ratchet Deadlocked together in order to meet the October 2005 holiday season target. And even then, Deadlocked went through some hoops to get to the point of what Insomniac were trying to do with this game, at first starting off as a vehicular combat game similar to Jack X, then switching over to a game that would revolve around Ratchet & Clank 3's battlefield missions with the Galactic Rangers, before finally settling on the idea of Dread Zone. So Ratchet & Clank 4 absolutely went through some development speed bumps, and I'm not exactly mad about that. Ratchet Deadlocked is such a unique Ratchet game, it stands out a lot in amongst the numerous amount of games we have for this series. And to also have this completely co-op Ratchet & Clank experience that is still very much a Ratchet & Clank game, but can be played in its entirety with a buddy, was at the time one of the coolest things ever. Also, the Dread Zone design of Ratchet is just totally badass, probably the best looking armor design throughout the entire series. I have to wonder though, will Insomniac ever return to the one global conflict, singular planet concepts that they had for the original Nexus in a future Ratchet & Clank game? It's something that I honestly think could be quite fitting for the next Ratchet title. But let me know your thoughts and opinions on this in the comment section down below. Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's video. Be sure to slippity slap that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Big shout out to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, and we'll talk again real soon.